Our next event is a spending panel consisting of a number of luminaries. Chuck Boucher, who was the Controller General of the General Accounting Office and a member of the board of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, will be one of our panelists. Larry Korb, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower, Reserve Affairs, Installations, and Logistics. Is Larry here? Hope he will come forward. Jim Colby. Jim is another member of the board of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, a longtime member of Congress, expert in all budget affairs, but especially international operations and trade. Maya McGinnis, who has already been introduced, the president of the Committee for Responsible Budget and all-around utility infielder on budgeting matters. And last but certainly not least, Bill Galston, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, who is an expert on matters of politics as well as budget. And he and Maya will have a sort of a joint presentation. And I'm not sure how we're going to begin here. Can we begin with in the order that they were introduced? And first is, and we have a little rule here about 7 minutes. And all those who don't observe it will lose their library card. Chuck Boucher.
Thanks very much, Bill. I'll talk fast here. I only have 7 minutes. But I have long been urging Maya to get to the specifics of the major program area, which she's done, and that's why she's convened this group and this meeting. And I think that's what you have to do if you're going to deal with the big issues when you have a budget or financial deficit. What I think you have in the federal government is you have 3 program areas that make up 80% of the budget, and then you have the revenue. And if you think of these numbers right now, we have a revenue of $2 trillion, and we have a series of programs in the federal budget that total close to $3.5 trillion. So you're missing $1.5 trillion, and that's why you're adding to the debt of over $1 trillion every year. And if you do that, we're adding to a $20 trillion debt, and all of you can figure out at various interest rates just how much interest you'd be paying. So I'd like to speak very quickly on the 4 areas, revenue and the 3 program areas. Defense is my first that I'd like to talk about. I came here in 1967 to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Financial Management. Under Bob McNamara, the war was going badly. The universities were in total revolt, didn't even go to graduations in '68. And we were out of control, literally, at the Pentagon, fiscally speaking. Bob McNamara was a great Secretary of Defense, is what the Commandant, General Chapman, said. For 4 years, he was a terrible Secretary of War. And even he couldn't control the budget deficit over the Defense Department once he went to war. And that's a truism. If you go to war, you lose control of the budget. Simply because you have to support the troops, and you also find out that you are supporting all the admirals and the generals and all the military-industrial complex for what they want. And so when McNamara came in, he got the budget of $45 billion. He made some really good decisions on weapon systems, but shortly thereafter, when he went to war, it was $85 billion, and the request for all the services in that, when I was there in 1968, fiscal 68, why the request totaled $125 billion, and he was trying to get it back to that $85 billion. Nixon ran on the fact he had a plan for the war, which he didn't, but he had a great idea of who his Secretary of Defense should be. It was Mel Laird. And Mel Laird came up with an idea of how to get out of Vietnam and how to get control of the budget, and he did it brilliantly. And he finally got us out. And he also got control of the budget by just giving fiscal guidance to the services and told them, you got to make some of the tough decisions in the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army, and I'll worry about the big issues. And that's how we did it, and we really did get control. And that's what we got to do again here. In other words, we're either going to do that or we're going to have a surtax like LBJ finally did in the Vietnam War and Bush 1 did on the first Iraq War. I was Comptroller General at the time. I made the estimate of $40 billion, but it was going to cost to get ready for the war. Remember the first 6 months of the first Iraq War, the Pentagon wouldn't make an estimate. I just sent my people over from the GO to get the numbers from them, and then we made the estimate for Leon Panetta, who was chairman of anything like that. And that didn't cost the American taxpayer anything because the war only lasted 6 days. LBJ had to do the same thing on the Vietnam War. He had a $28 billion deficit, which was huge at the time, and finally, as the budget people talked him into a surtax. And that's what you basically should have if you're going into war for any length of time. And of course, we haven't done it for the last 10 years. So my advice here is, if we're going to continue in that war, like some of the military people think we have to, then you should have a surtax. If you can get out in a year or two, I think the Mel Laird approach would be terrific. And Larry Thorpe is very familiar with how Mel did it, and I'm sure you'll be speaking more on the defense issues there. When you come to Social Security, I think if you read the paper that Myers people have put together, it's a very good paper on Social Security. There's certain issues. The one thing you got to keep in mind, with $15 trillion right now of debt, the Social Security did not contribute to that at all because they have a dedicated payroll tax. In other words, and they've thrown off $2 trillion of surplus, which we've used to buy B-1 bombers and other things in the federal budget. So we do not have to do major surgery on the Social Security. We have to make some adjustments for the future years because all the baby boomers are coming. But the truth of the matter is you've got to maintain the basic concept of Social Security for the elderly people. And if you don't, I'm old enough to remember when the country didn't have Social Security in the early 30s, and your grandmother generally lived at your house. So if you want your mother-in-law showing up at your house and asking for one of the kids' rooms, why, get rid of Social Security and put it all in the market. But I really don't advise that. That's what I thought was wrong with the George Bush plan a few years ago. And so, but I think with some modifications there in the future, just as this paper that Maya has in her brochure, you can do that. Healthcare is the mother of all problems. Of the three big ones, that's the toughest one, I think, because I really do believe that we've been just shifting the cost in how we pay from, first it's the government paying more than their share, then it's the private sector, and then it's the insurance company, everything like that. What we really have is an antiquated health delivery system in America, a boutique system that goes back to the 30s, and we're financing it in all different ways, and we change that financing from time to time. But the truth of the matter is today, you really need to go to a modern healthcare system. And the Congress asked me when I was Comptroller General in the early 90s to look at 5 other countries, Germany, Canada, England, Japan, and France. And it was really educational to see how those countries in a post-World War II situation did it. Now, they all don't have great systems. Every system has a problem. I always remember when we got to Japan, our interpreter said to us, why are you here? We've got the worst healthcare system in the world. So that was our start. But the one thing they have wonderfully organized over in Japan is for the pregnant mother and the children. In other words, they get a passport, as they translate it. It's kind of like buying a Mercedes car. If any of you have ever bought a Mercedes car, you get your big thing that says you got to bring it in every year so they can charge you $1,000 to make sure it's in good condition. See, well, that's basically what you get when you become pregnant, and you get all your inoculations, all the visits you're supposed to go. Then you've got what you have to do with the child until they get to the first grade, and you, as the mother, had better have that passport filled out when you show up in first grade, or I understand there's a lot of peer pressure about accepting your child into the first grade. So. But they have healthy kids. They have hardly anybody in the neonatal units, whereas, you know, we are spending a fortune in the first year of life, the last year of life in the United States. Our cost is way out of order. And yet we have great medical centers like the Mayo Clinic, the Marshfield Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, where you are now delivering modern, very integrated medical thing. The young graduates coming out of medical school, more than half are women today, no longer want to go into business with some old doctor in some small town with that obsolete x-ray equipment. They want to go into these great medical centers. We've got them in this country, but we don't have them very. Only the people that have a lot of money can fly to the Mayo Clinic or the Cleveland Clinic, or if you live near the Marshfield Clinic in central Wisconsin. Why, you get really modern care. I'm on the board of one of the big hospitals there in Washington. It's really good, got a lot of talented people, but it is not a modern medical center. And so that's what we've got to move to, and that's going to take an investment. So I think to really get on top of healthcare costs, we've got to make an investment in that. And one of the best examples of that is up here in Geisner in the middle of Pennsylvania, where the former dean of the University of Chicago Medical School went to be head of it 9 years ago. And he's working with 21 counties and all the hospitals and all the doctors in that area, strictly on a volunteer basis, and trying to tie them into his system. He gives them the computerized medical record system if they want to become part of his operation, everything like that. And it's really the future. And I think that we've got to look at the health delivery system if we're ever going to reduce the cost and improve the quality. And that's what he's doing up there. He's making it work. He's got the background. He knows how to do it and everything like that. So healthcare is one tough area. It's not going to get fixed in a year or two. We have gone up to $1 trillion in government costs in the healthcare before the Obama plan was ever put into action, or it was passed by Congress. So this debate that this is now going to break us, the trend has been straight up. I always remember when the head of CBO, when I was the GAO, the CBO would always say when he was asked for an estimate on the next move in healthcare, what's it going to cost? He would say very honestly, I have to give you a cost. That's required by my role here. But I want you to know I was wrong the last time, and it was always more. And I think that's a fair statement. So if we don't get the basic health delivery system modernized in this country, we will not get on top. So those are the three areas that really are going to make it up. I was wonderful to hear Congressman Wyden there saying, because we've got to fix the revenue base. In other words, you can't continue to have $1 trillion deficit in the federal government. And there's ways to do it. You got to do it on a bipartisan basis, and you know, right now that looks hard. But listening to Congressman Ryan and Wyden, I certainly am hopeful that that will work out. But we've got to really get these three areas on the expenditure side, and then the revenue side with the taxing modernized and done in a fair way with bipartisan support, if we're going to avoid the crisis. And having been involved in quite a few crises, starting with Penn Central and New York City and a few others, working a lot of times with Paul Volcker, you can always fix them, but a lot of people get hurt in the meantime. A lot of people lose a lot of money. I think our latest crisis was man-made here in the banking system. It should never have happened, but it did, and a lot of people got hurt. And so I just think we should avoid one where the government is the main culprit on how much debt and deficits they've had. And you can easily get it started by when you have California, Illinois, and New York in really bad shape right now, plus the federal government. I mean, we're out there on thin ice. Bob Rubin at one of my former meetings here this year said we are not Greece. Then he went on to kind of explain we might be Greece. And it's true. In other words, I think with all the hedge fund people in New York ready to go short at some point, just like they're doing to Ireland and Portugal and Greece, we're out on very thin ice, and we've got to get our financial house and our fiscal house in order, or there's going to be a big crisis not too far off. Thanks very much. I'll be happy to take any questions. Okay, fine.
I'd like to provide in my 7 minutes. We have a report that we put out at the Senate called the Strong and Sustainable How to Reduce Military Spending by 2015. As part of an effort we in the Senate did to get the budget back in balance by 2015. And there's also another report that's out there that a group Barney Frank put together for the Deficit Commission called the Sustainable Security Task Force to talk about how we can reduce defense spending as part of this overall policy we're trying to enact to get the deficit under control. Now let me begin by saying no matter how much money you spend on defense, you can't buy perfect security. No matter what you recommend, somebody is going to paint some apocalyptic scenario. And every time I hear about that, I'm reminded of the story about the elderly couple married for 30 years or so and decided that they wanted to go visit the Holy Land. Now, when they got to the Holy Land, unfortunately, the man passed away. And somebody came to the woman and said, you know, you can have him buried here for $50. She says, how much will it cost me to take him back home? They said, $5,000. She said, I think I'll take him back home. The man said, why do you want to do that? She said, well, I heard the story about a man who years ago was buried here, and after 3 days he rose again from the dead. So I don't want to take a chance. And of course, you can paint any type of scenario. Now, when we come to the war spending, I think it's important to remember this is the first extended conflicts, Iraq and Afghanistan, in our history that we have not raised taxes. In fact, we cut them, and we have not used conscription. And of course, since we haven't, we've driven up personnel costs astronomically. But what I'm going to talk about here is the baseline budget, because I think as long as you're in these wars, you're obviously going to have to pay the cost. Though I might point out that when the Obama administration came in, they said starting next year, the costs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan would be $50 billion in total. Well, that was before they tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan, and each troop you have there costs you at least $1 million, so you can figure out how much that's going to cost, depending how long we're there. Now, I'm going to look at the baseline budget, the non-war budget, and keep in mind a couple of things when I talk about the reductions. The defense budget in real terms, that is after inflation, has gone up for 13 straight years. This started before 2001, started in the Clinton administration, in which President Clinton actually spent more on defense than the first Bush administration had projected on leaving office. Now, if you count the war spending, basically we're higher again in real terms than we were at the height of Vietnam and the Korean War. If you look at the baseline budget, we're higher in real terms than we were at the height of the Reagan buildup. So that, I think, puts it into context when you begin to take a look at some of the areas that you can cut. Now, the cuts we recommended in both of those reports have all been endorsed, in fact, have been talked about by the Secretary of Defense, people in the military, the Pentagon's own task forces, and I believe will not, basically undermine national security. So let me talk about a couple of them. Personnel. Nobody wants to touch personnel. That's kind of the third rail. Gates gave a speech down in Duke yesterday, talked all about the problems, and didn't offer any solutions. Well, I tell you, the Pentagon has already offered its own solutions. They have a quadrennial review of military compensation, which in 2008 said, you're using the wrong base to decide on the pay rate. You're just counting, if you will, base pay rather than all the benefits the military have. If, in fact, you do that, you can save $50 billion over the next 10 years. Similarly, with the military's healthcare system, we haven't raised the premiums for retirees. I'm not talking about active duty people, since 1995. A family can be enrolled in TRICARE for $430 a year. We recommend raising it gradually for retirees depending upon the amount of retired pay. And again, that would save you another $50 billion. Secretary Gates several times said, we have 11 aircraft carriers, nobody else has more than one. He said he would like to reduce the number of aircraft carriers by 20, 40. Why do you have to wait? You can really easily do that now. Similarly, he said, you know, the Marines are building this new amphibious vehicle, expeditionary fighting vehicle, and he said, we haven't had an amphibious landing under fire since 1950. Why do we need it? Well, he hadn't canceled it. It's still in there, okay? And so you can, that can easily be cut. 3 analysts at the Air War College, okay? Not Brookings or the Center for American Progress, said you don't need more than 311 nuclear weapons for deterrence. Well, even the START Treaty only gets us down to 1,500 and 50. And then, of course, you have Dick Cheney's favorite weapon, the V-22, the tilt-rotor oscillator, which he tried to cancel. In fact, he called it a turkey. It's over $100 million per copy. We already have 150 of them. You can easily stop it there. And then there are several programs that basically you want to buy, but you don't need to push them as quickly as you should. For example, when the F-22, and everybody gives Gates credit for canceling it. No, it was not in the Bush had said that in Rumsfeld, going to have 184. He just basically carried it out because the Bush budget did not have it in there. But anyway, when he canceled, he said, well, no, we're not going to save any money. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to accelerate the production of the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35. Okay. Well, basically, then he fired the program manager because the program isn't being run well. So why rush it? I mean, you can slow it down. There's no immediate air-to-air threat that you have to deal with. And then finally, Secretary Gates has talked about, and I love this, and we've been around the government a long time. Well, we're going to save money by eliminating fraud, waste, and abuse, okay? And we're going to not put that money to reducing the deficit, but we're going to put it into other programs. I'd say if you can save it, let's put it into reducing the deficit. But good luck, I mean, because that's the easy way out. In my view, you've got to make some hard choices. Now, let me give you the final 2 hard choices that you need to make. One, Secretary Gates has an article in Foreign Affairs, not the most recent issue, the one before, said we will not do nation building under fire again. No more Iraq and Afghanistan. Well then, get the Army and the Marines back to where they were before 9/11. That's at least $15 billion a year because the cost of each man and woman in the service conservatively is about $100,000. And then the other is the Europeans are cutting the heck out of their defense budget because they got deficit problems. Why do we have 150,000 people in Europe and Japan? I mean, Cold War ended quite a while ago, and so we can easily take 50,000 people out of both of those, take them out of the force, and that will save money. Now, as Chuck mentioned, we've done this before. Reagan did it in his second term when supply-side economics didn't work as well as we had hoped, and we had those deficits. He and Bush one, even before the end of the Cold War, cut defense spending by some 25%. Eisenhower did it. After Sputnik, he refused to panic. Everybody was talking about how we had to, sort of double defense spending. I had to laugh when the Republicans put their thing out about, defense spending, and as part of their overall plan, they quoted Eisenhower. And I thought, you guys don't know what Eisenhower did. In fact, he was criticized for not spending too much money on defense. Nixon did it after the end of Vietnam, and as Chuck mentioned, Melvin Laird came in, cut the budget, modernized the force, got us out of Vietnam. Let me conclude with this to tell you, Foreign Policy had an interview with Secretary Gates in which he announced for the umpteenth dozen time he's leaving. I mean, to me, that's ridiculous. He's got one foot out the door. I would say go. Okay? I mean, you keep talking about it. Let's get out of here so we can get on with dealing with these. But nonetheless, he talked about it, and Fred Kaplan wrote it and said he's the most influential secretary since McNamara, or the most significant in terms. I said, no, the most significant was Laird. And I mentioned the thing. Okay, into the draft. Got us 520,000 people out of Vietnam, built weapon systems we're still using today, and cut the budget by 1/3 in real terms. That's significant. Well, I wrote this on Foreign Policy, asked a number of us to comment on Kaplan's article. Next day, my phone rang, and it was Laird. He's 88, and he said, thank goodness somebody remembers me. Well, I hope we remember the example, whoever succeeds Gates and can do to the Pentagon what he did. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel talking about some of the issues that confront the Congress and the nation when it comes to trying to determine how we are going to get a handle on the budget deficit and the long-term fiscal problems. My assignment this morning is to just talk to you very briefly about Social Security, which has already been covered by Mr. Boucher in the opening kind of overall comments here. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more specifically about reason probably that I'm up here talking to you about this is that more than 15 years ago, Charlie Stenholm, Democrat from Texas, and I formed what was called the Public Pension Reform Caucus in the Congress of the United States. We didn't say Social Security. We didn't say anything about what we intended to do with it because we didn't really know when we entered into it. But we did know. We were smart enough, I think, to be able to look a bit beyond the horizon that most of us, when we're in politics, don't want to do or don't feel like we can do. We look beyond that and can see that Social Security was facing a long-term problem. Well, the long-term problem is now with us. It's no longer long-term. It's not even really medium term. It's really short-term. It's here. It's on top of us now, and we really are confronted with making some real choices about what we're going to do. Now, the reason that, to me, it's easy to talk about this is that I think that the solution to this is relatively easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's relatively easy in the sense that, unlike healthcare, where we really don't know where the costs are going, we really can't tell what's going to happen in the way of technology and innovation. And we don't know how the costs are going to increase over the years. So with Social Security, it's a pretty fixed formula. Yes, inflation can go up at different rates, but we know how many people there are. We have a good idea of how long these people are going to live. So we have a good idea of what the payouts are going to be. And that tells us where we stand with regard to the revenues that we're receiving versus the payouts that we have. And the problem, the evidence is pretty clear. We are in trouble. When we started the Public Pension Reform Caucus, we talked about the fact somewhere in 20 years later, there would not be as many revenues coming into the system as there were outlays. You heard Ed talked about the fact that we have been paying for these aircraft carriers and all the other goodies in the military from the excess monies that have been coming into Social Security all these years. It's not as though we stuff that money away in a pillow someplace. It's just simply money that becomes part of the General Revenue Fund, and an IOU goes into the trust fund for Social Security, so it gets spent as part of the regular appropriation process. Well, those days are coming, those halcyon days are coming to a close. Because the fact is now, this year, sometimes it may have adjusted slightly this year, but within the next year or so, the revenues received by Social Security are going to be exceeded by the outlays. Now that's a very significant step. That's a very significant moment because it means we can no longer rely on Social Security at all to help pay some of the costs of what we're doing elsewhere in the government. Now you say, but the trust fund's there. We still have the trust fund. Yes, the trust fund's there. The trust fund, of course, is, as I've already noted, really just on paper. It's money that was deposited and IOUs put there. So now to recover and cash out, if you will, in that trust fund, the government simply has to go out and borrow additional money beyond what it's borrowing for paying the deficit. It has to borrow the additional money to pay the Social Security cost. And that number starts to rise fairly dramatically until by the year 2037, at the latest estimate, you will run out of those IOUs that are in the trust fund. At that point, assuming nothing has been done, and it is hard to imagine that we could let this thing go that long, but assuming that were the case, in 2037, the law would require an immediate cut, and it would be 22% cut in benefits at that point. Now, how many politicians do you think are going to sit quietly by and allow that to happen and see that happen? So the point is, we really need to make some choices now. As I suggested at the outset, I think the choices are not that difficult because we know what the numbers are, and we simply have to say, here, what are the different things we could do to adjust Social Security, and then make some decisions about which ones of those we're going to do. Well, here's some of those that we come up with in our report, and I'll come back to the politics of these for a second just at the end. One, of course, is to raise the retirement age. We're already raising that retirement age to 67. That was part of the agreement that was made in 1983, which had a fix for Social Security for a considerable period of time, but that fix has now run out. But we are raising the retirement age to 67. Our suggestion is to accelerate that up to 68 by going 2 months each year, so that in the course of only 6 years you would reach a retirement age of 68. And that makes sense if you stop and think about it. When Social Security was created back in the 1930s, the lifespan was barely 67 at that point. Today it's over 80. I always like to point out that the first Social Security program was created by Bismarck. And when he went to the Kaiser, at least so the story is told, when he went to the Kaiser said, well, this is going to be expensive, isn't it, to do this? He said, no. You see, you don't draw benefits until 65, and the average today in the German Empire, the average life is about 50. So he said, hardly anybody's going to ever get paid any of this money, but they'll think at least they're getting something out of this thing. Well, those days obviously are long gone. And we are now, people are drawing benefits, and they're drawing benefits longer. So raising the Social Security age is certainly one of the things that could be done. I should have said before I got to this point, the two things that are driving this problem now are of course, right now we have a recession with a lower amount of tax revenues, but the big thing, of course, is the aging population. The aging population has changed the demographics. More people retired, living longer, fewer people out there working. That's a prescription. It means not enough income is coming in, revenues are coming in to pay the costs of this. So, all right, what can we do? I mentioned the one thing of the retirement age. A second thing would be to raise what's called the superlative consumer price index. The consumer price index now is based on the adjustment in the benefits is based on the urban wage earners' average salary. I mean, it overstates what is actually spent because there is what's called a substitution. This gets a little complicated and I won't go into it. There's what's called a substitution. If prices go up, people will substitute one product for another. The CPI doesn't account for that. It'll account for the fact that if you go from taking one kind of apple to another kind of apple, that will be accounted for. But if you decide that apples are too expensive and you go to bananas, it doesn't account for that. So if you go to what's called a chain CPI, where all those are taken into account, you'll have a substitution that will result in a lower consumer price index and a more accurate consumer price index that really is the real case. A third thing would be to go to a progressive price indexing. The current law, the benefits are determined by adjusting workers' wages forward. Then they average. In other words, when you retire, you say, what would be your wages going for the next 20 years of your life if you were working? You average those, then you offer a progressive formula for increasing them on top of that. So that may make sense for low-income people who really get very little out of the Social Security system but it probably doesn't make a great deal of sense for those that are high income. So we're not talking about simply making Social Security a welfare program only for the poor, but we're talking about changing the benefits slightly so that it would be a slightly different benefit for those who are high income. And fourth would be to add on, fourth would be to reform the payroll tax to make it more progressive. You could actually change the tax in a way so that it's a different percentage for different people based on the level of their income. That's controversial, of course. All of these are, to some degree, are controversial, but that certainly is controversial. And the last thing is really not a change that results in additional revenues, but it's one of the things that Charlie and I had in our legislation, and that is to have additional retirement accounts. Now, we had it as a carve-out so that there would be a percent of the payroll tax you pay now would go into the IRA or the retirement account. But the other possibility, which we include in our paper, is simply that you would voluntarily take another 2% of your payroll and put it into that account. And there would be no withdrawals of it before age 62, but it would create an investment that you own. They would go into index funds that would be stable index funds, just as those of you, and many in this room, are in the thrift savings plan from the federal government, that you're able to do and make those investments the same kind of thing. Now, finally, let me just say a word about the politics of all this and how this is going to happen. My own view is, again, that this is the easy one compared to what we're going to hear next about healthcare. Easy in terms of trying to figure out what to do and then to do the politics of it. I am absolutely convinced. People have always said it's the third rail of American politics. So we had the fix in 1983. It was a disaster for Republicans that were running in 1982 on that. And Republicans have always had this view of don't touch Social Security. I don't believe that's true any longer. I think the American people are ready to talk about this. They understand there's a problem, just as they do with the whole fiscal crisis. When Charlie and I started this thing, I went out and did town hall after town hall and seminar meetings like this. We brought in the experts to talk about how you might fix Social Security, and people are ready to hear these kinds of changes and talk about this. People care about their children and their grandchildren. And young people are in despair because they know that the Social Security system that they see today for their grandparents isn't going to be there for them in that same way. It simply can't be there. There's no possibility that it can be there in the same way for them. And they understand that. And so I think they're ready for the kinds of political changes that need to be made if we have politicians that will give them honest answers, confront them, talk to them honestly about it, and let them make some choices. And so what we need is some political will on both sides of the aisle in the Congress of the United States and in the executive branch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Congressman Ryan challenged us to have an adult conversation about these issues, and he said that he put his plan on the table not as the end of that conversation, but the beginning, and we've advanced ours very much the same spirit. The early returns are not encouraging. However, a well-known liberal economist / blogger has already accused me of, quote, endorsing Hooverism. I don't. I'm sorry?
Thank you. I'd also point out that if Congress were still in the business of deliberating and enacting appropriations bills, Congressman Ryan might still be here to participate in this conversation. Let me tell you what this document is and is not. It is not in any way a full budget. It is a budget strategy with some numbers attached on the basis of which a full budget could be constructed. And it represents what Maya and I were able to agree on, which was quite a bit, but not everything. I have not yet been able to persuade her of the virtues of the National Infrastructure Bank. She has not yet made the sale to me on progressive consumption tax, but we both continue to live in hope. What we do is three things, basically. First of all, we make the economic case for the importance of long-term fiscal restraint. CBO Director Doug Elmendorf just a couple of days ago gave congressional testimony in which he pointed out, with analysis to back it, that the very measures that are helpful in the short term are harmful in the long term. And so this requires some careful analysis and some fancy footwork. And obviously, if you have an ideological view that won't distinguish between the short term and the long term, then you have a problem. We try not to fall into that trap. Secondly, we violate in this budget one of the oldest principles in Washington. Old Washington hands will tell you never to put a number and a date in the same sentence. Well, we do. We propose a number, a target, that is to say, federal debt held by the public of roughly 60% of gross domestic product by 2020. It is now on track, if we do nothing, to hit 90%. So our target is 30 full percentage points of GDP, lower than that. That implies that a reduction in the debt held by the public in the year 2020 from $20.3 trillion to $13.5 trillion, a reduction of $6.8 trillion. And that is the aggregate of deficit reduction, in effect, that we are proposing in this 10-year budget strategy. And finally, reflecting the distinction between the short term and the long term, most of our proposals are phased in so that the fiscal effects of our plan are backloaded. We want to synchronize, and did our best to synchronize our ideas with the pace of the economic recovery as best we can anticipate. So the third and final thing that we did in this document was to lay out a series of specifics. And let me just touch on some of those specifics under the heading of the 5 principles of reform that we announced. First of all, the principle of shared sacrifice. What that means is that we have to address the entire budget, not just a piece of it. We can't sequester a piece and say, that's off limits. We have to look at the whole thing. We have to address the problem as a whole. Second, let me give you an example. When something is a quintessential shared sacrifice, as war is, or at least ought to be, then we should all participate in it. So among many other things, this document proposes that starting in the year 2015, if we have war-related expenditures on top of the Defense Department's base budget, whatever that is, we should enact a war surtax to pay for it rather than passing on the costs to our children and grandchildren who are going to bear enough burdens thanks to us as it is. Second principle that guided us in the construction of this budget, encourage growth. Without a steadily growing economy, there's no way to get out of this hole, no matter how prudent we are in fiscal policy. So we propose various kinds of pro-growth tax reform. We suggest that part of the proceeds of a proposed carbon tax be used to reduce the payroll tax rate, which should encourage employers to do more hiring. We talk about an aggressive attack on tax expenditures as the basis for lowering marginal income tax rates, and we propose a similar strategy on the corporate tax side. We protect and underscore what we regard as essential public investments, and part of our Social Security plan is intended to enhance national savings, which is also pro-growth, through 2% savings accounts on top of the current system, which for low and moderate income workers would be matched progressively by public contributions to these individual savings accounts. Third, and relatedly, we do the best we can to protect the Americans, those Americans who are most in need, while increasing the progressivity of our current budget taken as a whole. We focus our reductions in benefits at the top rather than making them across the board. And to take another example in the area of Social Security, we are in favor of a device slightly different from the one Jim Colby proposed, but to the same effect, that is to say, to increase the progressivity of payroll tax. And we also propose a new minimum benefit for long-term, low-wage workers who work hard all their lives but don't accumulate enough to generate really even a minimally adequate retirement benefit at the end. Fourth principle, transparency. And that means, among other things, calling items in the budget by their right names. A lot of the features of the current tax code are backdoor spending. Let's be frank about that. Tax expenditures are spending that dare not speak its name. And we think that our approach to the budget ought to reflect that fact. Fifth and finally, we believe that any long-term budget plan for the country has to acknowledge basic realities. Our demography is not fixed, it's changing. Our population, even with reasonably robust immigration rates, is aging. There is no way that a federal budget cannot respond to that fact. And similarly, unless the federal government gets entirely out of the business of dealing with health care expenditures, particularly but not only for retirees, then the fact that health care, even with maximum restraint, is likely to rise faster than the CPI as a whole has to be taken into account in our budget. So, what is the bottom line for our proposal? I conclude with 3 summary points. First of all, between now and 2020, we propose a 50-50 split between program spending reductions on the one hand and revenue increases on the other. Second point, those two taken together will produce substantial additional reductions in outlays from lower interest payments on a smaller federal debt. And overall, this is the moment you've all been waiting for, relative to the CEO's estimate of President Obama's budget in the year 2020, outlays under our plan would be 22% of gross domestic product rather than the anticipated 25.2% reduction of 3.2% outlays. Revenues would be 21.4% of gross domestic product versus the currently anticipated 19.6%, an increase of 1.8%, and the deficit in the year 2020 would be not the anticipated 5.6% of gross domestic product, but rather 0.7%. As a result of all of this, public debt in the year 2020 would be 60% of gross domestic product and not 90%. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to try doing this from here if it's working. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Oh, there's voice activated. All right. Well, thank you very much, Bill, for explaining kind of the budget strategy that we did. And thank you very much for everybody coming this morning. I had a bit of a pit in my stomach when I woke up and heard the rain and thought, geez, I don't want to go. I'm not sure if anybody else is going to want to. So I'm glad that everybody was able to make it. This has been a really interesting project that Bill and I worked together on developing a budget strategy, and it does fit into the framework of the whole purpose of this conference, which is it is time to get specific on budget solutions. I think that the country is well aware that there are problems now. The discussion has yet to kind of pivot onto really digging deep and saying all those specific things that put a little bit of a pit in people's stomach, like, those aren't very fun, but we know we have to do them. And I think it's helpful for the White House Commission comes out with its recommendations to get a lot of these things on the table. So I'm very grateful to all the people who've joined us today and the budget experts who are here in the audience. So quickly, just to reinforce a couple of the points that Bill brought up, there's no question when you look at the budget and you try to fix the situation that in the long run, entitlements are the problem. The growth in the budget is coming from healthcare growing and the aging of society. However, the medium term, I think the emphasis is not going to be on entitlement reform because those programs are going to be phased in more gradually. And now as a result of the economic downturn and the crisis we just went through, we don't have the luxury of time that we used to. And we have to make real progress in our budget in the next decade in order to reassure financial markets that the U.S. will get its fiscal house in order and in order to create an environment where businesses start investing and things like that. And so I think in the medium term, the lesson that we learned from going through the numbers and trying to figure out where the fix is, it's going to have to be on the discretionary side of the budget, and I very much include defense in that area, and revenue side of the budget. That's where most of the changes are going to come. In the long term, there's no question that healthcare and Social Security are going to be the big, and tax expenditures are going to be the biggest areas for reform. And one of the things I think that's very interesting in the proposal that we put forth is we suggest in various ways putting both healthcare and tax expenditures into actual budgets. So in the and both of those in the end we would limit the growth. And basically you realize that as time goes on we'll have more ideas about how to do that. We just went through healthcare reform, and if there's one thing we know, it's that we don't know how to do everything. And this is going to be a constant struggle to keep healthcare costs controlled. I think the same is true with tax expenditures in terms of a political struggle. And so we recommend limiting them and capping them in the long term to keep them in line with what the budget can afford. Another main point I want to emphasize is that I do think tax expenditures are perhaps the most promising area of the budget for reform. These are really so much more like spending programs than they are tax cuts, and they're just funneled through the tax code. And all told, we lose more than $1 trillion a year in revenues. The plan that Senator Gregg and Senator Wyden have proposed focuses an awful lot on tax expenditures, which I think is very promising. And in the next panel today, we have one of the world's leading experts on tax expenditures, Marty Feldstein, who's going to come and talk a little bit about his ideas here. I just think if there is a piece of the budget that is right for reform, this is it. On the specifics of the budget plan, it's there, and I hope we'll talk some about all the specifics and hear what people in the audience are most interested in specific changes. But just to touch on a couple things, in the area of defense, like Phil said, we don't go after war spending because we don't sort of, I think, see that we should be the ones making recommendations there. But it is time to pay for any war activities that go forward. We do focus a lot on getting savings out of defense from some of the very good work that defense experts have been putting out recently on weapon systems and compensation. The compensation part of the defense budget is one of the fastest growing areas of the budget. We also look at discretionary freezes, significant changes to Social Security that we believe would be good for the economy and help increase saving levels. On healthcare, we try to bring in demand-side pieces of healthcare reform that weren't part of the last round, so more cost sharing, malpractice reform. We would raise the Medicare age because we now have an opportunity to do so with the new healthcare exchanges that were created. That gives a lot better ability to start kicking in government spending for healthcare a little bit later in life. On the tax side, we focus on tax expenditures, saving as much as we possibly can, and using some of those savings, but not most of them, to reduce rates. And we look at replacing part of the payroll tax with an energy tax, which I think is a tax that both of us are very, very strongly in favor of. Like Bill said, we had other taxes that we couldn't come to agreement on, but on an energy tax, we're pretty convinced we should be doing a lot more of our revenue raising there. And we also recommend corporate tax reform. So, just some of the lessons that were learned. I mean, the long run is now. We used to talk about entitlement reform in the city, and then when it would fail each year, you'd say, okay, well, we have another year. And we just don't at this moment. And that means that we have to put a plan in place as quickly as possible. And it doesn't need to be phased in right away. In fact, it would be unwise for the economy to make aggressive deficit reduction this year or next year or probably the next year. But if you put the plan in place in a credible way now, and it's phased in when the growing economy can accommodate it, that serves two purposes. It helps get control of our fiscal picture, but it also is reassuring right now in a way that can actually allow the expansion to go better. In working through the numbers, and we spent a lot of time really figuring out as best we could the numbers, we came up with the goal that 50% of our changes should come from spending and 50% in tax increases in the medium term. And in the long term, we would look much more to the fundamental changes in entitlement reform. I think two of the most important principles we came up with were picking policies that promote economic growth. We cannot grow our way out of this problem, but we cannot get out of this problem without economic growth. And so we were very cognizant of that and thinking about the kinds of tax reforms. I must say that Bill came up with a number of really innovative tax proposals that I think will help promote growth along the way. We're very strong supporters of protecting the pieces of the budget that are investment-oriented. We have a very consumption-oriented budget. We would protect the investment pieces of it as much as possible. And we both have the shared goal of protecting the vulnerable. People who depend on government programs should be the last to bear any burden. And I think we were pretty successful in coming up with that plan. So just to conclude, I've done this exercise before. It's a very interesting thing. I did a Social Security plan a number of years ago with a Republican colleague and a Democratic colleague, and I did a joint tax plan, which you hear a little bit about in the next panel, but with Bob Carroll and Buck Chapton and Diane Lim Rogers from the Concord Coalition. And what I found in all three of these exercises is that it's hard because you have different values, but it's not that hard. And yet in Washington, what we do is we spend our time fighting about the margins. And that's the most true in the political system. But it's also true for us policy analysts, because we kind of make our living by, sort of, well, let's disagree on this one tiny piece. But in the end, when you look at what it's going to take to fix the budget, it's going to take everything. Everything is going to have to be part of the solution. And there are not that many ways to do it. So if we could sort of shift our gears away from negotiating mode into compromising mode, I think we would find that there's an awful lot of overlap even when people come from different political perspectives. I do think it's really impressive what some of the politicians that we've heard from today have put out there by getting specific, and what Jim Colby and Charlie Stenholm have done in the past on bipartisan Social Security reform. I hope that we will see more of that in the coming years from politicians. And most importantly, I think we're expecting big proposals to come out in the next months. The Domenici-Rivlin Debt Reduction Task Force and the White House Commission are going to come out with comprehensive budget plans. And those of us in this world have the choice of picking out the 1, 2, or 10 things we don't like about it, or supporting the notion that we need to put together these comprehensive plans that are going to move the discussion forward and get us on track to do that. So I'm very hopeful that these kinds of discussions about specifically what we should be talking about, we'll notice that we haven't talked a lot about earmarks today or other things which may be part of the solution but not the big pieces. I think as we move to that big discussion, it's going to pave the way for these comprehensive plans as they're released, and I'm very hopeful that the next year will really be the year of getting specific on solutions.
Thanks to members of the panel. We will now have about 20 minutes, a little more, of questions for the panel. This is your opportunity to make them get even more specific. There is a young lady with a microphone. If you are in the back of the room, if you are in the front, it might be easier to holler. Oh, there's a young man as well with a microphone. But please try to make them questions and be as terse as you can be. You can address your questions to any member of the panel. Others that may wish to help answer. They are all experts in everything.
Okay, a question for Maya and perhaps other members of the panel. The carbon tax or the energy tax that would then lower the payroll tax, I think our organization would support that entirely. I am curious about how that then affects the Social Security Trust Fund, given our concerns about where that's going.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's always been discussions about whether revenues from the Social Security, whether Social Security needs to have the dedicated revenues and whether they need to be direct contributions from people. I think that we would calculate benefits the same way as though they came from the payroll tax. So you'll be credited based on your wages, your contributions, and your share of the payroll tax, in addition to the revenue source that's supporting it being an energy tax. So it wouldn't change the benefits. We make a lot of changes to benefits that would achieve solvency in Social Security, which is the goal. You have to strengthen Social Security so that it's solvent. We do that through direct benefits that we make as transparent as possible on the retirement age, on progressive price indexing, on switching to the superlative CPI, which I think is a better measure of inflation. And then we wouldn't alter your benefits at all based on the fact that we would just use a superior revenue source to finance the system.
Any other comments here, Paul?
No.
Okay, next question.
In short, I'm wondering, this question's for any of you, and question in short is there any low-hanging fruit that we can pick, or any policies to increase revenues or cut government spending that would work? I mean, we know the political atmosphere in Washington is awful. It's toxic. It's really hard to get anything done. So, do you find anything relatively easy that we can accomplish in this hearing?
Well, again, I think there are a lot of programs in the Pentagon that you can do if you've had the political will to do them. It's interesting in the Republican platform that they put forward, the only weapon system they mention is missile defense. They say fully funded. They don't give a number. But there are weapons, that you can do, comparatively easy. There are missile defense programs that are not working, that you could cancel. Basically, you can take troops out of Europe. As I say, you go to Europe, they're not worried. In fact, I was in Europe last week, and one of the generals from one of the countries said, you don't need more than 25,000 troops. You've got 100. I mean, just things like that I think you could do. There'd be no, obviously I don't think Americans will get upset if you have less troops in Europe, for example.
Yeah. There may be another opportunity. I have been surprised over the past 6 months by the amount of agreement across the political spectrum on the principle that tax expenditures really are expenditures. That's number one. And number two, that because they've been used as a backdoor strategy and a default strategy, they've really run out of control, even more than a lot of other sections of the budget. And that may connect up with something Senator Wyden said at the beginning of the conversation today, namely that if you frame a broad discussion about tax reform and then talk about changes in rates as well as aggregate revenues within that framework, we may get farther than if we simply argue out the issues in the same old boxes that lead to gridlock and stalemate time after time.
I'd suggest two that occur to me as I don't know how easy they are politically, but low-hanging fruit. One is a gas tax. An increase in the gas tax makes sense. You've got fairly stable gas prices right now. A small increase in the gas tax would make all kinds of sense and would go a long ways to helping our infrastructure. And the second one would be one that was in the Social Security that I mentioned, the increasing the age to 68. We're already doing it to 67. I don't think anybody's going to blink twice about continuing to increase that age for full retirement to 68. So those would be two that I would think of right away.
I would say no low-hanging fruit. Maybe it's all been taken. Maybe there's some medium-hanging fruit. The things I would identify is I do think the superlative CPI, switching to a better measure of inflation is important because right now it's overstating benefits. We're paying out more than you have to just to keep up with inflation. And it also affects the revenue size of the budget. So we're actually collecting less in revenues than we would with a proper statement, proper calculation of inflation. So it's a technical fix. I think that's a very good place to start. Obviously, any of the areas of the budget where you could find productivity gains would be terrific. We know they exist in the Defense Department, but there's political pushback when you actually start to get there. I do think there is a tremendous appetite in the country right now for defense savings and real security reform and rethinking the role of defense in our budget. Healthcare productivity improvements, we know that they're there to be had, but we don't know how to have them. And in many ways, all the low-hanging fruit of healthcare reform was just used to pay for the expansion of the new healthcare entitlement. So that now makes this still single most important area of the budget all the harder. People have been talking about the tax gap for years. I pretty much think if we could close it, we would have. Who wouldn't want to fix that area of the budget? Pretty much whenever anything sounds like too good to be true or a free lunch or pretty easy to do, it's not that doable. I do think the area of fundamental tax reform is really important. I don't want to oversell the ability of, tax cuts don't pay for themselves. We can't grow our way out of this. But if you want to start at a really bad place, it's our tax system, which means we have a lot of improvements to make. So I think most of the fundamental tax reforms that are out there would vastly improve the system and would contribute to economic growth. I just don't want to bake a lot of those assumptions into the calculations. And I think in the end it's going to be the notion, let me say two more. I think raising the retirement age and looking again at the healthcare exclusion, not low-hanging fruit at all, but pieces of policy that most people in the policy community on all sides of the spectrum agree on. So I would look at where policy experts who aren't constrained by politics tend to agree. In the end, I think it's going to have to be this message of shared sacrifice in order for people to come and deal with medium-hanging fruit and hard things, which is, I think people are willing to do it, but they have to feel like everybody's part of it. They're not kind of the sucker who's making all the sacrifices when no one else is.
Question. You got a microphone over here? There's a gentleman you just walked right past.
Oh, okay. I didn't mean to elbow anybody out of the way. I wanted to ask a little more about the defense issue. I'm part of the Sustainable Defense Task Force that Larry mentioned. We talk about $960 billion in savings over 10 years. I'm glad to see there's a specific number in Bill and Maya's paper. I was wondering how important is the issue of personnel costs in terms of what Larry mentioned about actually lowering personnel in Europe, possibly rolling back the increases we've had since 2001 in terms of the overall picture, because personnel drives some other expenses in terms of equipment and so forth. I just wonder if either of or any of you wanted to comment or give your perspective on that.
Larry, do you want to start?
Well, Bill is on the task force, but he should know. One of the problems we have is because the country has guilt feelings for overstretching the force that we have. Nobody wants to touch military compensation. And for example, when the Commandant of the Coast Guard retired, he said, my family, we're going to be paying, $400 a year for one of the best health care plans going. His pension is $180,000, okay? So he said, well, wait a second. I think, we could afford to, raise that. And that's what we recommend, to raise it in accordance with what people make. The other is that, as I mentioned, you're using the wrong standard to decide how much the raise is, and then the compounded, Congress adds even more to that every year because nobody wants to, say anything about the truth. Well, if you continue to do that, you're going to get like Secretary Gates yesterday said, well, personnel costs have gone up from $90 to $170 billion since 2001. Healthcare costs have gone from 30 to 50, and our calculations are going to be 100 billion. Well, that's going to take, you're going to be like General Motors unless you do something. And again, I think that we all know the answer. The question becomes, do we have the political will? Now, what we argued in our paper is you want to do that, which you should, you're going to have to make a social compact with the troops, not to do what you've done, not to give them 2 years at home for every year that you deploy, which is the standard we're supposed to have in Guard and Reserve, more than 1 out of every 6. Now, if you get involved in another one of these conflicts, then I think you're going to have to go back to conscription. We still make men register when they turn 18. And the reason we do that is when we created the all-volunteer force, we said it was for peacetime, not for extended conflicts. I mean, maybe like the first Gulf War, which lasted 37 days. So that's what we got to do as a nation. And if you don't want to do that, don't get into these darn fights again. If you don't want to raise taxes, and I think that's a really key thing. And if you do that, then I think you'll be able to deal with it. But I got to tell you, I'm not talking about active duty people. I'm talking about the military retired lobby. They're as on you as any lobby in this country is. Okay, and fortunately, I happen to be a military retiree, so I get all their magazines every month in which they blast me, on these things. But you got to do something, okay? And if you don't, you're going to have to live with the consequences. If you want to spend, like General Motors, all your money on personnel and health care, even if you don't cut the budget, you're not going to be able to buy the weapons that you need.
Yeah, I was introduced to this subject in 1968 when they had the Hubble, named after Admiral Hubble, looking at the retirement costs, which at that time were estimated to be $4 billion, which was a small percentage of the defense budget. And I remember Admiral Tazewell Shepard, who won the Navy Cross at 21 years old, when his ship was attacked by the Japanese and all the senior officers were killed, and he took over command and saved the ship, basically, said to me, he said, the problem is we're bringing everybody in for 20 years and 30 years. And that was set up in 1940 when the services were so small they were hardly a military force, you might say. Today, a young person comes in and goes into the Navy, he's in the nuclear submarines, let's say, at 18, 38, he retires, he gets a 50% fully indexed pension for the rest of his life. He could live to be 88, you see. And so why not bring what we did in World War II? We bring the young people in for 2 or 4 years. We give them a GI Bill or some kind of a real payoff when they leave. But we don't set ourselves up for all these pensions that are huge. And now we got the medical care, as Larry points out, which we didn't used to have. In the old days, if you were a career retired person in the military, you had to live near an army base to get your free medical care because that's what had been promised. But now you get Medicare at 38 for all practical purposes. And so the costs are huge in this area. So it has got to be one of the major areas, and it's going to really take a major change. But actually, we could have even a better force, I think. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing it. And I think it's been studied to death. All the information is there. It just needs some leadership here, and we could do it. And the European, Europe had standing armies for years because they were always fighting each other and that. And there's a great book out that's called "Where Did the Armies Go?" And they're talking about Europe. They don't have them anymore. They're getting rid of them. They're ending even in Germany now, the conscription. So we can have a very strong defense force and have a very great reduction in the personnel costs.
Other panelists?
I just want to pay you a quick compliment because I think Secretary Gates, by talking about defense savings and the need for them, has really opened the door in an incredibly useful way that you can only have when somebody who oversees that part of the budget talks about needing to rethink it. Now, of course, he would allocate all the savings to other parts of defense, and I look at it and think, I need to scoop that in and use it for deficit reduction. But I think that the report that the Sustainable Defense Task Force has put out is just immensely helpful, and it's the exact kind of thing that we need to have. It's very specific, it digs down, and just it's really impressive work.
Could I just add a word on this topic that is a somewhat different vein? The comments that we've just heard, particularly from Larry and Chuck, reveal a fundamental fact about this fiscal discussion, and that is it cannot be decoupled from our fundamental values as a nation. In the past 2 generations, 40 years, we have embraced a military model in which a tiny fraction of Americans do our fighting and dying for the rest of us, and the rest of us watch it on television. And that has all sorts of consequences, many of which
many of us believe, and I'm one of them, are not entirely positive. You know, this model of an all-volunteer force which insulates the fighting and dying from the rest of the society has not only beneficial but also perverse consequences. And some of those consequences are fiscal consequences, as we've just heard, but only some of those consequences. There are societal and moral consequences as well. And this budget discussion might be likely an occasion to re-examine some of the fundamental problems, fundamental premises of what we share as Americans and what we pass off as specialists.
No, you're wrong. The ABF is a peacetime force. It is not a wartime force. And the politicians and the people who sent us to war don't have the courage to do what they're supposed to do. I can show you a memo that I prepared for President Reagan to keep draft registration, which the Joint Chiefs of Staff signed off on because he was a libertarian. He wanted to get rid of it. And we said it's a peacetime force. That's the problem. And that's where we're letting them down, okay? And it's all of them. Charlie Rangel introduced it. How many votes did he get, okay? President Bush had the authority to do it. And what we do is just the opposite. We have a backdoor draft where you stop loss and all this type of thing. That's the problem. If the president had said before we went to that mindless, needless, senseless war in Iraq that we're going to have to draft, people have asked a lot more questions, and the members of Congress would have read that national intelligence estimate, which showed in the classified version there was no case for going to war. That's the problem.
Well, Larry, I think we're agreeing vehemently. Because, you know, as a matter of the basic legal framework, of course you're right. But as a matter of lived political reality, in the past 40 years, we've nullified half of that legal framework.
I thought one of the great decisions that Mel Laird made was not only to decide to get out of Vietnam and had a plan to do it, but to end the draft. And I was at the meeting in the Secretary of the Navy's office when he announced it. It was really interesting because the admirals and the Marine generals, they were tired of the Vietnam War too, and they didn't raise any questions. But they practically went up in smoke when they heard that there wasn't going to be a draft because they were so used to having a draft in there. But I think the all-volunteer force was the exact right thing for peacetime, as Larry points out. We should not go back to the draft during the peacetime. That, to me, it would be a huge mistake going back to that. But we should just give the young people that come in on a volunteer basis a very good deal when they leave after 2 or 4 years. We can have a very strong force and everything like that. But I do believe if you're going to war of an extended period of time, surtax to pay for it, and then you got to go to a draft. And I think that will focus the mind of whether you should be going to that war.
Okay, let's have another question.
Hi, thank you for all being here.
The last question.
I would like to challenge the premise that you can find savings in the defense budget specifically as it relates to reducing the number of military personnel and their modernization accounts. And I throw that out there based on 3 things. First of all, defense spending as a percentage of GDP, as is noted in one of these reports on, I think it's page 8, shows that the baseline defense budget has not increased more than 1 percentage point as a percentage of GDP in the last 10 years. Second, most of the deficit spending as a result of defense spending is as a result of unpaid for war spending, which many of the panelists have already identified. And then the third point I would make is that most of the increases in the military personnel budget are a result of a much larger national problem, which is rising healthcare costs. So given that for the United States, and that not only did we need to maintain the modernization accounts we had, but we actually had to increase the size of our Navy, particularly in the Pacific, why shouldn't our focus in the defense realm be on improving DoD's financial management, reducing the healthcare and compensation costs, and focusing on paying for war spending before going into the actual number of military personnel and the modernization accounts given our commitments overseas?
Well, first of all, GDP is irrelevant, okay? Because I remember when I first got into this business, when I was on active duty and I interviewed when I was writing my thesis this admiral, and I said, well, how do you determine how much to spend on defense? No, we get a certain share of the GDP. I said, what happens if the threat goes up and the GDP goes down? He said, can it? Yeah, it can. What you got to take a look at, we make the big point in the sustainable. What are your enemies spending? That's what you got to look at. GDP is irrelevant, okay, in terms of things. And similarly, I agree that we recommend you take the troops out of Europe and take them out of the force. Okay, so that's how you get the get the savings. But if you have a defense budget, which right now we get, and we're almost half of the rest of the world, and is higher in real terms in Korea and Vietnam, you need to take a look at it, okay? Because in Vietnam we had 520,000 people in theater, and we were spending less. But we also had, a surtax, and we had a draft, okay? I mean, and that's the thing. We're talking about, for example, the military retirees. Admiral Allen, he mentioned it himself, makes $180K. And by the way, we changed the retirement. Nobody looked at it. Used to be you were capped at 75%. Now you get 100%. Okay, if you see, there was no debate about that. He gets $180,000 dollars. $400 for health care. Even he said that's wrong. So I mean, that's the point that we're trying to make. The other thing that happened, I cut the retirement system when I was there because, as Chuck mentioned, the thing was getting out of sight. 20 years, 40%, leave 30 years to save because too many people were leaving. They went and undid it with no debate. Okay, TRICARE for life. It used to be when you're 65, you went into Medicare. That was fine. Well, now they got TRICARE for life. Again, no debate, no money put aside for it. So if you want to do this, somebody's got to sit down and say, well, how are you going to pay? How are you going to pay for it? And then what we're recommending here is pretty moderate. I mean, a TRICARE, there's no fee to enroll. Okay, we said means tested. $120 is all we're talking about. You see what I mean? Those are things that you can do. And what's happened, and it goes back to the point that Bill was making, because nobody wanted to take it, nobody wanted to talk about these things because of what we were doing. And it was immoral what we've done to our military people. The financial thing just got out of hand, and now Secretary Gates gives this great speech yesterday. Okay, now what? Okay, what are you going to do? It's already, you had your own review in 2007 and 2008 told you what to do. Why haven't you done? This is the Pentagon's thing, not a group of us. Okay, all right. That's so you're going to need the political courage to do that.
Okay, well, let's put Larry down as undecided. No, I think that the statistics, you can always play with statistics and numbers and everything, but one thing you ought to remember is that in 2001, before we went into these wars, why we were spending $350 billion on defense in the defense budget. Today it's up to $750, and if you add the triple increase in the VA and the interest costs and everything like that, the total cost of defense right now equals all the income taxes we're collecting from the individual tax system. And the only way we're funding it is we're borrowing the money from China and all the sovereign funds around the world. We can have a really strong defense, the best in the world, without any question, if we get back to the same level we were in 2001 after we get out of these wars and that. And all we got to do is take these major issues and do it.
Thank you very much, panel. Let's give a show. We will have a short break of a couple of minutes.